I'm going to pick up where Jerry left off and come at it from a different angle. But before I do, let me just first show you some of the companies that have been involved here. You've got some big ones, some household names. You've got some newcomers that are gas specialists. You've got large independent exploration companies. You've got another shale specialist exploration company. And I just hit the wrong button. And the two down on the bottom are the second largest gas producer in the U.S. and the largest gas producer in the U.S. And we'll talk about where they are in a minute. I've got to be careful here. Before we do that, I think you need some background on what drives the oil and gas industry. Most companies will tell you that they want to maximize shareholder value. That basically means maximizing share price, but it's a softer, easier way to say it. Higher shale price increases their ability to borrow, which increases their ability to drill more wells and to expand, and drives the share prices higher. And all that isn't too bad for executive pay either. Now, to drive that shale price up, the biggest single factor in stock prices for oil and gas companies are their reserves. If they add reserves, they drive up the stock price. Reserves are basically oil and gas in the ground that can be extracted with existing technology and current prices. Chip mentioned the accounting rules. They're massive, they're very detailed, but this is what it boils down to. Oil and gas in the ground that you can extract with current technology and current prices. Wall Street's looking at increases in those reserves. They're also looking at increases in production for companies that handle both the producing side as well as the exploration side. And for those companies, they want them to replace more reserves each year than what they produced. If you miss the targets, Wall Street hits your stock price. And Wall Street hammers you. I've been in meetings with a dozen Wall Street analysts, and they want to know all about your production, all about the things you're drilling that could add to your reserves, what you're doing to replace reserves that you've produced, and how you're going to keep production up. They watch it like a hawk. Too far. Okay. This is another curve that shows the steep decline in shale. Conventional oil and gas does not decline like that. So when you're playing in shale, it's even more important to fund good projects. Otherwise, it's going to drop off like a rock on you. Basically, within each company, they've got to allocate the financial resources that they have available. And they're going to do that to the best prospects that they have among many different plays. The larger, mid-size and larger companies will take leases in several different areas, more leases than they expect to drill. And they allocate their financial assets across those. And traditionally, the price scale has been higher for oil than for wet gas and lowest for dry gas. So a dry gas well needs a very, very high volume to attract capital to be drilled. The process that they go through, they buy a lot more leases in prospective areas than they really expect to drill, to give themselves a lot of options. Then they'll obtain permits for the most prospective leases, and they will apply for more permits than they expect to drill. I'll show you later that a lot of wells have been drilled in New York, but far more permits have been applied for. They'll drill some exploration wells in the most prospective areas to try to find those reserves. If they're successful, they'll drill more wells around, which greatly expands the reserves. If they're not successful in that first one, they will think the whole thing over. If they think they did something wrong with the well or something like that, they might try again, but they often will just leave and go someplace else. Once they've got reserves delineated, they'll drill producing wells throughout that area and build out the infrastructure, the gathering lines, the transmission lines, the separation plants, the compression stations. Some companies do all of that. Some specialize only in the exploration side, and when they find something, they'll sell it to a company that does the whole thing. Companies value the data that they get from wells. For every well they drill, they keep data. It's proprietary information. Limited amounts have to be reported, which is some of the data that Jerry used and some of the data that I used for what I'll show you later. And that includes information on the formations the well encounters on its way down. That data is archived because it's very valuable. If you want to sell a well, or if you want to sell your company, you're going to put all of that data in a data room, and the prospective buyers are going to come in and look at it. So just the fact that a well was drilled and wasn't targeted at the Marcellus, if it was targeted a layer below the Marcellus, those companies would have collected some data that could be valuable for determining where they want to drill later. And the same goes for the Utica. Many of the wells were drilled down through the Marcellus and through the Utica into a formation called the Trenton Black River down below it, which you see here. So if you're drilling down, you're going to go through the Marcellus. There's some sandstones, limestones in here that could be a target, or you might be going all the way down to the Black River, in which case you're going to have some data on the Utica and the Marcellus. The data includes cuttings from the well logs, and logs of the drilling mud that comes up out of the well. The cuttings can tell what kind of rock it's in. There are well logs that go down that will identify layers along the way. Both of these are in the Marcellus category. The Union Springs is a black shale that has high total organic content. The Otaka Creek is a gray shale with low total organic content. That well log that they have will give them an idea of how much of the good stuff is in that particular well. And they get a lot of other data that's collected. There's a public source of this information. That other stuff that I talked about, the company's going to keep. But there's a searchable database that the DEC has. And that's what I've used. Public information that's on the DEC website. It gives a lot of details. I think there are about 30 columns of data. Operator, county, town, target formation, producing formation if there is any, where the well is located. They'll even give you a map of each individual well, whether there was any production by year, the formation depths, so each layer is reported, and the type of well, whether there's a vertical well or a horizontal well, and a lot more pieces of information. There's a disclaimer here. There's a big disclaimer on the website. They take the data that the companies give them, and that's what I've taken. But there could be some problems in that data if you were to go back and check it against a company, which we can't do. The following charts show completed wells that targeted or passed through the Marcellus, and many of them passed through the Utica. On some of the charts, you'll see active permit applications. What I've excluded is any well that wasn't completed for any reason, like the permit was canceled or expired, the well had a problem and didn't go down to depth. Those are out of here. So what you see are only dots on the map that should provide some data to somebody. Okay, let's start. I'm going to start over around where I live because that's where I started looking at this. Tioga County, interesting, 6 gray dots there was Amoco, who came in before the shale boom, well before the shale boom, but they drilled a pattern, a clear exploration pattern of 6 test wells. They were all dry. They abandoned them. Amoco has subsequently been bought by BP. BP is not in New York State, they went to Ohio. Just one piece of information. These green dots are 3 actual tests that fracked. They all fracked the Utica, and 2 of them fracked the Marcellus. The one up here in the corner is too shallow to do the Marcellus. So they fracked Utica, 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 Marcellus, Marcellus. One of them produced 35 MCF a day for 10 days. That's $100 a day of gas for 10 days. That is not going to pay for a well. You remember Brian's line of death comes up through here. Well, maybe they're dead. But that company then took a permit and started drilling a conventional well down below the Marcellus, just across the border into Chemung County. I guess they had enough. They got rid of almost all of their leases over here, and they have abandoned this. All of these wells have been plugged and abandoned. Unfortunately, they use the old DEC method of plugging, so they're not plugged terribly well. Chemung County was dominated by Norse, a Norwegian company that bought into the area. So these are all wells that they drilled down. Not many of these went down to the Utica. Most of them did go, all of these would have gone through the Marcellus. Delaware County. We've had several players, some of them are interesting. The orange dots are Gulf. You remember Gulf Oil? They still have some service stations around, but Gulf was disbanded, and the upstream exploration producing side was picked up by Chevron long ago. So that data is in Chevron's database, and you don't see Chevron anyplace around. Anschutz, who you may know of because they've been around in this area, notably in Dryden and a few test wells, they drilled a couple of wells over here before the shale period. When it came time to come back, they did not come back to Delaware County. Okay? We have a few other wells that were drilled. The colored dots indicate current well applications by Chesapeake, the second largest, and by XTO, the ExxonMobil affiliate. These are applications that are in line. The one XTO well that Chip mentioned was an application that has already gotten through the point of having its spacing unit approved. For any of these wells, if it's going to be a multi-pad well, you need 640 acres. All these others, when you look at them in detail, probably have enough acreage there to be approved, and the DEC has been pretty flexible in granting those things. So I think you can say that these are areas that 2 of the big guys think are worth looking at later, or thought. Maybe they don't anymore, but they did at one time, and they haven't changed the things. Going to move across to the west, Broome County. You've got wells, a number of wells that have been drilled down through the Marcellus, and again, many of them through the Utica. The permits over here are Chesapeake's, XTO, and these are permits that had been put in by Norse before they went into liquidation. Norse, I should have talked about this on the previous slide when Shenango was up there. Norse had several really nice wells that produced and earned a fair bit of money, but they had a lot of very low producing wells that tailed off. And I don't want to say for sure that that's what was their demise, but it looks like the lack of productivity in the large number of wells that they drilled, having only a few good ones, is what really did them in. They also had a few permits up in this southwest corner of Shenango, but they're in liquidation, so the chance of that coming through as future drilling by them or anybody else seems pretty unlikely. Tioga County, number of wells drilled. Let me double check something. All of those were dry holes. That means that when they drilled down to the formation that they were aiming at, they didn't get anything, and so there was no production there. It doesn't mean that they didn't get information about the Utica and the Marcellus. This is a very recent dry hole by Carrizo in Owego that actually did target the Marcellus and it came up dry. Move across to Chemung. Lot of data from a lot of wells. Interesting point, I don't really count this as meaning a whole lot, but Eastern Resources had applications in down here and pulled them. Not exactly sure why. Chesapeake, again, second biggest driller, still has applications in Chemung. Tompkins, probably some interest in that. Some test wells, some of the Allstadt wells, Chesapeake wells, others, no permits in the county, and the Dryden Permit that is causing the court battle over home rule right there, which Allstadt gave up. Norse picked it up. Now that Norse is bankrupt, who knows? So if we go back to the permits, XTO has permits down here in Delaware and Broome in the corner. Chesapeake has permits also in the corner. XTO has no wells in New York State. XTO is heavily active down here in Pennsylvania, and they probably are just extrapolating across and looking for permits in this area to see what they might pick up coming across the border. Chesapeake is also heavily involved down in Pennsylvania, and they have a number of permits, and many of those permits are for multi-pad wells, probably 6 wells at a time. They'll only drill one, and if it's good, then the others come. If it's not good, they'll walk away from the other permits. There are some wells that tested the Marcellus, declared the Marcellus was the target, and here they are. About half of those never produced anything. They're labeled either temporarily shut in or shut in, but not having any production. The others produced at very low levels. The highest level of production that I could find was below 15,000 MCF per year, which is about $45,000 worth at $3 an MCF. So hardly enough to be worth drilling a well. But these are the few data points that we have where the Marcellus was actually tested and didn't come up looking terribly good. There are a couple of other permits that show up out here that I haven't included. They're by small companies, and it's not clear whether they're really serious or active. So if you boil that down, you've got this arc of permits by the 2 biggest gas producers in the U.S. that goes right around the corner, Delaware, southern tier. And what does that look like? Does that match up with what Jerry was saying, that if there's anything, it's right in here? Okay. So the DEC showed this whole area, or the press picked up the whole area. The DEC in their S-guys said this whole area should be the fairway for Marcellus in New York. So here's what others in the industry have said at various times about it. Okay. I'm not going to go through each company by company who they were, but here's one that looked at the whole area, question marks up here, and loops around that same corner. Here's another one. Not so good. You see they've got this area, but tailing off. This one is by Professor Engelder. It's hard to read. These counties are the hotspot counties down in Pennsylvania. These across the border in New York tail off, and they tail off. Another one, this one's a little bit further west. And another one right around the corner. So if you're looking at putting all of that together with this, with Jerry's data, it pretty much says that if there's anything in New York, it's down here. That's where the companies seem to have focused in. So what does that all mean? Are we going to have a drilling boom in central New York? Very unlikely. Could we have intensive drilling in some areas? Yeah, possibly near the Pennsylvania border, but it's unlikely to be widespread much past there. Will there be test wells? I fully expect that there would be test wells near the Pennsylvania border. Elsewhere, there are thousands of drilling companies. There are always some that just have to take a shot someplace. Instead of going to the casino, they put it here. So, will there be drilling elsewhere? Yeah, I think there will. Probably not a whole lot, but there will be companies that come around and try it. And unfortunately, those can be the least reliable outfits because they will try to do the wells as cheaply as possible. The DEC has very few regulators out there in the field, and the regulations themselves are not that tight. I think you could see it, but I would worry about these test wells that are in the outlying areas. Infrastructure impacts, very likely. We already have them from Pennsylvania, but if you get this kind of drilling in New York, you'll have the centralizer ponds, compression stations, gathering transmission lines, and then you have the whole disposal suite of problems. Getting rid of the flowback fluids. Pennsylvania is struggling to move all of those out. The possibility of people wanting to drill disposal wells in New York, even if there is no production. Brine spreading on roads. The DEC has conveniently classified this as okay. And cuttings going into landfills. And we're starting to see indications of high radioactivity levels in that. So none of the projected economic benefits that the DEC piled into the S-guys, all kinds of fancy indications of economic boom. You could have the intensive drilling. You're almost certainly going to have the test wells, and you get all of this stuff for very little of this. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up, and thank you very much.